us. Welcome to the alignment. Welcome to episode 2 of the alignment. This is the webinar which asks our speakers to align on a certain topic. I am Adam. I'm going to be your host. The topic today is building a localization team. Things you can get right or wrong. We've got some fantastic speakers. Just before I go into our speakers, just a little bit about us. We are global app testing. If you want to know what we do, the clue is in the name. The reason that we're doing this webinar is that we have worked really closely with loads of product teams to do their QA for them in a fast manner. We do that with our crowd testing community. So we're a community of 100,000 testers around the world in every different country, I think 190 countries and territories. And we do everything from basic functional QA through to user survey style stuff in all of those different countries around the world to a time frame. The reason that we're doing it is because while we've done loads of amazing work with product teams, we're still relatively unknown in the localization, internationalization, globalization space. And so the reason that we wanted to do this is just to kind of say that we exist, because all of our most exciting work with some of our biggest clients is focused on this idea of global growth and starting out from that point of how do you grow in all of the different countries that you're live in when you're live in a whole bunch. So that's us. We obviously wanted to tell you a little bit about us, but we also want to hear from you. So this is trying to be a discursive webinar. We want to make it as discursive as possible. For that reason, I'm going to encourage you as our speakers speak to use the Q&A function. Apologies about the chat function being broken, but I can see that the Q&A function is alive and well. If somebody is saying something that is interesting to you, please ask questions. I've written some questions and we've got a load of amazing questions from the entry form. So thank you for adding those. But I think it's always great to add questions on the night as well. So please do, and we will get back to you with an answer if we can't get through. Our speakers today. So we've got 5 amazing speakers. The way that this is going to work is each of them is going to talk a little bit about a subtopic on in order, and then I've got a couple of questions for Sofia at the end. Then we're going to launch into a panel. We're going to ask all your amazing questions, and hopefully we're going to align on the subject of building a localization team between us. So first we've got Alex. Alex is a localization project manager here at Global App Testing. He is focused on supporting some of the biggest localization businesses in the world. He's going to ask us 3 questions that localization teams face and maybe give us an answer. We're going to have Zach second up. So Stripe obviously needs no introduction. The payments company that has increased the GDP of the internet. I think that's the slogan. Zach heads up localization at Stripe, and he's going to be talking a little bit about that function and how he's made it super efficient. Brian McConnell runs localization at Notion. He's also previously worked at Lyft and Medium. Brian's going to be talking to us a little bit about vendor management and why they've made the decision they have to bring some of their vendors in-house. And finally, Iggy, if you have been following our localization content, which I'm sure everybody in the audience has, Iggy needs no introduction. I interviewed Iggy on our blog. You should check it out. It might be posted in the chat. And also we reuse some of that material in our localization playbook, which you can check out as well. Finally, Sofia is the manager, the CS manager over at Phrase. I've got a few questions for Sofia about what makes effective teams in the context of tooling. So I've got through that as fast as I can. I'm going to hand over now to Alex, who's going to be asking us 3 questions that localization teams face. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Adam. Hey, everyone, I'm Alex. And as Adam mentioned, today I want to suggest 3 tech trends that we're observing about localization teams and the way it affects localization quality. Very briefly about me, I have been working at Get for 5 years now. And before that, I worked in different QA roles at the gaming company. I currently work as a project manager for some of the biggest teams in the world, many of whose apps you actually use on a daily basis. So today I will talk about, or I will ask 3 questions that we usually see teams face and how it affects their use of the global crowd. So the 3 questions are: how to incentivize indirect focus, how to think about local expertise, and how to deliver more efficiently. Jumping to the first one, how to incentivize and direct focus. Now, if you attended the last webinar, we talked a bit about team narratives. Some localization teams have a series of tasks set by a senior team, like product or marketing, and usually they want to adapt the work they've done, which is built on a domestic theory of users. Now, this kind of team thinks about quality in a commodity sense of way, and the way they use GET reflects that. Usually they want to verify they've executed on the line items quickly and effectively, so they're interested in a rapid turnaround that we deliver, and they're really interested in a version of QA which is about verifying the L10N changes and that those are accurate. Their external QA is usually adversarial to their team or their LSP, sorry, because the system is designed to ensure that everybody is marking everyone else's homework. Now, the alternative is that the L10N teams are working much more towards delivering a specific metric. Because that team is setting its own agenda, they're hung up on a question like, what's the smallest amount of work we can do for the biggest impact to that metric? When we find something which is actionable, whether that's a UX issue, like an experience a local user describes, or it's a compatibility issue, like checkout is working on a certain device, we're working with the team to help identify the opportunity, as well as verifying it's subsequently being fixed, meaning that it's non-adversarial. It can be that in the first team, you have an amazing product team, which is asking these kinds of questions about international users. And because lots of these changes can be quite specific, I think a lot of the product teams have a kind of architect mentality, which involves a big roadmap. And it's the information often gets lost. I think it's really powerful to just keep asking what can drive growth. Jumping on to the second question, how to build local expertise, we have seen teams handle very differently the way they build local expertise. This absolutely affects the way they do QA. I read Adam's interview series. It was interesting to see that Pleo, which is an expensive solution which launched across Europe last year, checked all their localized copies with their team because they felt that they couldn't trust an LSP to get the brand tone right. Now, nearly all the interviewees commented that they would have preferred local country experts in their most important markets. So some were like Japan, for which there's more nuance to get right, versus somewhere like the Nordics, where everyone speaks English. The challenge is that it puts those professionals in a position of tremendous power because they become the owner of not just quality, but proxy for user sentiment. And it's very easy to lose analytic rigor and to shoot from the hip. And this person is probably not an expert in copywriting, UX and UI, or local solution building, but perhaps they are an expert in every demographic and or user context. Are they an expert in the kinds of analytics which would enable them to perceive a serious like checkout flaw, which is hidden in user data? What we need is communicable globalization data that can come in analytics to respond to different country metrics. And a lot of time we find ourselves doing these theses, building these theses to explain the data. And perhaps the profile you need is someone who can gather that data about these different line items and share them with you or with the experts in your team. Jumping on to the third question, thank you, Adam. This one I'm going to ask rather than comment, because I know Zach is going to talk a little bit about this one, which is the squeeze for effectiveness. And my question is, what does effectiveness mean? Because I think it actually takes us back to that primary question. What is the outcome we're going for? Is effectiveness delivering a list of actions, or are we talking about squeezing suppliers or doing more automation or doing more with less? If effectiveness is delivering a metric, then we're talking about greater clarity on local users and their experiences and identifying how to grow where you are. Now, the way we work with the teams, the role that crowd testing plays is very different, and so are the outcomes we see. And that's where my work as a localization project manager is headed. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Alex. I know I've been asking everybody in the audience to ask questions throughout on the Q&A. I'll keep pestering you to do that, but now I'm going to turn the tables on you and ask you a poll. So obviously, Alex drew a distinction there between teams which are motivated by operational metrics and incentives and teams which are motivated by commercial metrics and looking after something like growth or new business. I'd love to see how it's distributed among our audience and where they think they are. We're going to hold this poll open for 5 minutes while Zach talks, and then we will close it and we'll talk about it among the other things at the end. But for now, I don't want to hog the mic anymore. I'm going to hand straight over to Zach. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm currently running localization for Stripe. Bring with me about a decade of experience in the industry, work both client and vendor side, bounce back and forth a few times. Some of the more notable companies I've worked for and try to bring some of that experience with me is Uber, Lionbridge, and the big word. I joined Stripe in early 2022 as the original role was to start develop the quality program or make a more formal quality program. Since then, I've taken over running it at a higher level, which has been quite the experience and also quite an honor. As we delve into today's topics, I'm probably going to approach it from a slightly different angle. That I'm going to be looking at it through the lens of building a program and discussing the more fine points of tuning a team within a program to go after maximum effectiveness. And in my opinion, the key to building a really robust program for max effectiveness is finding the proper balance between kind of four things. It's kind of a grid of four things. It's internal versus external resources, and across that, it's your infrastructure versus human capital, and just being able to make sure that they blend and mix in a way that's going off kind of Alex's last point, that works for the company's end objectives, because depending on your situation and your circumstance, the company you're working for, the effectiveness is going to be defined differently. So I really like the idea of building a team within this premise, as opposed to just seeing a problem and potentially throwing a person at it. And while building a team is not necessarily that, looking through the lens of more of a program and how to maximize overall effectiveness with all resources available, I think is going to yield a higher result. One last point I think that's kind of fun with working in the industry right now is with the advancement of technology, whether it's LLM models or even just standard machine translation models, there's an expectation for us to become more and more efficient and more effective. That's putting a lot of pressure on people to scale up and meet those expectations. But what I find fascinating is we're now getting the tooling to beat those expectations. So it's no longer this like lost premise that we can do more for less. It's an expectation we should be hitting. So I'm excited to share my thoughts as we dive into the subject, hear what other panelists think, and hear from their expertise and some of your questions. So thanks so much, and I'll go ahead and pass the mic back. And once again, super excited to be here.
Thanks very much, Zach. I'm gonna now close the poll. So thank you for those of you that voted in it. We'll share the results at the end and discuss it a bit then. But for now, I'm going to move straight on to Brian, head of localization at Notion. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Brian McConnell. I'm head of localization at Notion. And prior to running localization at Notion, I also led the localization teams at Lyft, the ride-sharing platform, and the blogging platform Medium, and a number of other startups. My kind of niche, I guess, is that I go into startups and growth companies when they're just really starting to build out a localization function and team and help them get systems and vendors in place and all that. Most companies have almost no exposure to localization unless the founders happen to be, from a region where many languages are spoken, and that's often not the case, at least in the US. So what I'm here to talk about is the distribution of work between in-house resources and outside vendors. So one of the things we've been doing at Notion is really leaning into leveraging our own user community as part of our translation team. So we're fortunate in that we have a very large and active user community, and we have a lot of consultants who've built businesses around helping people set up Notion sites. And a lot of those people have background as linguists or as marketing copywriters. So we made a decision in the past few months to really, instead of leaning first on outside translation vendors, building up our own translation team and using vendors as kind of a backstop, we have too much work to do. And we've been very happy with the results because these are people who know our product better than anybody. And in many cases, they know the product better than we do. And so they really understand a lot of the terminology and, the language we use around the product, whereas an outside vendor is always going to struggle with that. They're never going to, they'll do good work, but they'll never really understand your product like, as somebody who's virtually an employee would know. The one caveat I would add about that is that it works, you kind of need two things for that to work well. One is you need an active user community who's really cares about the product. If it's like a business-to-business accounting software or something, you'll probably have a hard time finding those people. And the other thing is that if the volume of work is overwhelming, it doesn't scale. In our case, we have a couple 100,000 words worth of content we need to manage in each language, and that's something a small team can handle. And actually, vendors in that case, in many cases, just aren't that interested because there's not that much work for them. And that was the other thing that drove us to this, is that we were finding vendors are just, there are other companies that do millions of words a month, and that's where they're going to focus. So that's my 2 cents, and looking forward to Q&A and discussion that follows.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brian. Just to plug the Q&A again, if you do have questions, please do dive in with your concerns or questions around how to build a localization team. Obviously, we've assembled this panel. We've got loads of questions have come through from the entry form, so we've got loads to get through, but it would be great to hear yours in the audience as you're watching. Finally, I'm going to hand over to Iggy, who is here to talk about the entrepreneurial team mapping need to value. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Yngvild, or Iggy to most people. I'm a senior localization manager at Deliveroo, which, in case you're not familiar with, is a leading food delivery company. I've been in the industry since about 2017, and I've been working at companies like Expedia and ClassPass in that time as well. I've seen some ex-colleagues from some of those companies online today, so special hello to you. There's one term I've kind of come to hate recently, but it's this in this macroeconomic environment that we hear a lot. But in this economy, teams may not have the budget available to add additional headcount. I think that's the situation lots of us find ourselves in. So that's why I would like to spend the next few minutes talking about how, instead of hiring people, you can utilize the resources that you have available to move your team into the right direction. So if you're working in a business that's relatively new to localization, chances are that the localization team was recruited to fill a specific business need, being organizing and overlooking translation and localization, perhaps typically during an expansion period. This is all well and good, but I think a majority of localization professionals know that we can contribute so much more beyond just project management. Like perhaps you'd like to move away from this expectation of localizing large volume as quickly as possible, and instead focus on delivering growth for your company at a more strategic level. And if this sounds like you're probably going to want to redefine the localization team purpose, align it with the business needs, and start building and developing a team to deliver on that purpose. And as it sounds, it's not an easy feat by any means. So probably is something that requires you to get out of your comfort zone, harness pretty much all the skills you have in your toolkit, and also be willing to learn a few new ones. But I think personally that this is exactly what makes it so rewarding, because it's not just a chance for you and your team to grow and develop, but you're essentially rewriting your own job descriptions, and you'll get so much more clarity on what additional expertise that you will need in order to get to where you want to be once hiring becomes more of an option. And I think the first thing you want to make sure is that you're not abandoning these tasks that your company initially kind of asked you to do. So this like more traditional project management, just because you want to start doing something else. And one of the key reasons for that is stakeholder relationships. I'm going to say a little bit more about that as well later on, but you're looking at making quite a big change to the perception of your team and the nature of your role. So you're going to need the buy-in from the people around you to do that successfully. So definitely make sure that your stakeholders are happy with you along the way. And this is kind of like a key thing that is like, while you're going through this transition, it's you're caught between doing like your old job and also hashing out your new job. And I think kind of to Zach's point earlier, I think a key thing to do then is making sure that you can make your traditional or old tasks as efficient as possible. So that could be like automation, making sure you have fit for purpose project management tools, do process improvements. Exactly what it is will depend a little bit on your team, but the essence there really is that you need to free up the time and the headspace to be able to focus on getting your team to the next level. So in my case, for instance, this is something we're constantly working on in my team, and we're not by any means there yet. But I think there's a few team qualities that come really handy as we're going through this process. And some of those are having mutual trust, having a democratic culture, and the openness to discuss failure and successes as we're going through this. So I think if that's, I'm conscious that not every team might have those qualities. Kind of, I feel very lucky that that's what defines my team. But I think there's definitely things that you can do to foster those qualities if you don't already have them. And equally, if you're on a one-person team, which is a position that I've found myself in the past, it's like strange to talk about team culture, but I think if you are on your own, it's even more important to make sure that you have a support network around you, whether someone in the business or someone outside, because essentially what we're talking about is like not just building a team that works for you or building like a role that works for you, but building a whole team where you want to bring in new people and where everyone can grow and thrive. So my last point on this before I hand it back to Adam is that there's like my philosophy here is basically that anyone's skills and interests can be an asset when you develop a team, but there's one skill that's non-negotiable, and that's the interpersonal one, because in order to identify the business needs and where the localization team fits into that, you do need to listen to stakeholders, understand what's important to them, understand what their challenges are and how they work. Because this is a radical change and you're going to have those difficult conversations at some point. And it's so much easier to do that if you already have a good relationship with these people. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say, and looking forward to hearing your questions later on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Iggy. That was really interesting. And then finally, so we've got Sofia with us. Sofia is the Senior CS Manager at Phrase, the TMS system. Sofia's not going to be speaking for us. I've got a couple of questions for Sofia, just before we go into the broader panel and all start piling in on the questions together. Sofia, obviously, Phrase, it's a TMS system, and you're onboarding different customers all the time, and you give clients advice as you onboard them. I wonder if you could start by just giving us a sense of, is there different advice that you give to different kinds of localization teams in order to promote their effectiveness based on their size or some other thing that makes a difference within localization teams that you serve?
Yeah, absolutely. First, just to say hi to everyone, and it's a delight to be here. And thank you for the lovely introduction. We don't build localization teams, obviously, as such a phrase, but in my capacity as a customer success manager, you're absolutely right. We do offer our best advice, and we do look at, or we come across teams, I should say, of various teams structures and things like that. So that's exactly where we would start. We would kind of have a look at what's the team like, what's the size, what's the structure, what's the current process that's in place, where are they at? Are they only just starting out, or is this a larger team who are looking to optimize, centralize, standardize, things like that? It's also important to look at the available resources. Excuse me, I'm a bit croaky, but we look at the available resources. Do you have, I think Brian mentioned it, like a large community that where you can pull on to localize, or do you have an in-house team of resources, or are you pulling in vendors like language service providers, things like that? So once we have that picture in place, we also obviously need to look at the appropriate tooling, making sure that it's fit for purpose. What are the aims and achievements? If you have a much smaller team just starting out, they're aiming to localize an app to enter another market or two, right? That's a different scenario to having a much larger enterprise team where they're saying, we need to onboard different stakeholders, centralize everything, and make our process as efficient as possible. So those are the kind of important considerations to bear in mind. We do also have a playbook for localization managers, so absolutely do check that out. It's got some, though I say so myself, it's got some great advice and makes some great points in there. Finally, what I would say as well, just to round off this question, is that you have to also be prepared to review where you're at, right? Tweak the process as you go on, because that will set you up for success in the future. If you're, not afraid to take a look in the mirror and see, where are we at and what could we improve as the journey evolves. Yeah.
Very good. In our recent report, that we're going to publish. So I say recent; it's actually our forthcoming report. But in our forthcoming report, one of the things that we find is that cross-functionality, or working cross-functionally across all different stakeholder groups and teams, is the biggest internal pain point of the localization professionals in this survey. I wondered, to me, that seems like something that has a solution that's partly answered by tooling. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how Phrase, or how you think about cross-functionality in your role.
Absolutely. So it's obviously a big challenge. Like, how do you involve localization in the process? At what point do you do it? I think in the past, it's often been the case where localization is left to the end, especially within software localization and things like that. So the key is, how do we involve more teams in the process at a different stage, but avoiding complication? So I would say the answer to that is to actually enable collaboration as much as possible, and to centralize the translation management. And you're absolutely right where you say that's a question that can be answered by tooling. The way we do this at Phrase, right, to enable cross-team collaboration is focusing on connectivity. So having connectors, having plugins, having integrations to other systems that are used within a business, be that design systems, it could be code repositories, content management systems, things like that, to essentially make sure that each team can focus on what they do best. They can work in their own environments, but when it comes to localization, that they can connect, right, collaborate with the localization team, by communicating, by connecting, and kind of working together in that way. So it's crucial to have tooling that allows this, because what you get with that is then also a scalable solution that can also keep up with growth and with demand, right? We want to avoid bottlenecks as much as possible, and set you up for success in that way.
Final question then. So when people kind of start on their journey with you and they come through the door, I wonder if there's a challenge that you see come up again and again that's the sort of the most common recurring challenge that you see among different kinds of teams and how you would think about that.
Yeah, we have a few kind of topics that come up. We've touched upon one of them, like the lack of cross-team collaboration, or the difficulty, if we want to put it that way, the difficulty in actually getting teams across the business to collaborate with each other and handle the localization in the right way at the right time. What we also see is still lots of manual work, actually, maybe a process that isn't optimized, a process that is inefficient, bottlenecks, right, within the localization team, where you have content coming from various other directions in the business, and a team that is quite often overloaded, right, and needs to have a more scalable solution to manage with automation, or to scale up their team and increase their output and efficiency. And then another thing, I mean, I'm not going to rattle through like the whole list, because it will sound like everyone's got a long list of problems. But the final thing that I would say is also a disconnect, like between the stakeholder and the localization team. So this goes back to what Iggy was saying about really knowing your stakeholders, understanding it. What is it that they need to achieve, and how can you help them get there? Right? Because at the end of it, ultimately, it's about a collaboration, right? Aligning, to use the phrase, right, of today, but aligning to meet the company's goals. And if there's a disconnect there, be that because of, I don't know, change management not implemented correctly when it comes to tooling, then that can be a big blocker. So yeah, those are the things I would kind of say we do see again and again.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sofia. I've got this slide. I can see this is the localization playbook that we have. So if you do want to access that, we're putting it in the chat right now, and there's a link to ours as well. Right. So we've got the poll results that I can share with everybody. But just before I do that, I would love to hear a couple of other people come in on some of what I talked about with Sofia. Cross-team collaboration, the biggest issue, biggest challenge that we see as an internal pain point. That's a very much a team issue. I wonder if any of our panelists had any tips for, resolving challenges that surface around internal cross-functional collaboration.
Yeah, so I would say that's an issue with startups in general. I mean, localization does bear the brunt of it because it's an inherently cross-functional role, and it touches every aspect of the company typically. But the startups I've worked at, I mean, it's just chaos for the most part. So if you're in a startup or a growth company, it's just something you just have to learn to deal with. Unfortunately, there's not really an easy fix for it, I found.
So in your view, it wouldn't be a pain that you'd associate with larger businesses. You're framing that as a startup issue that is associated with the lack of processes that you get in startups. Yeah, I mean, big companies have their own set of issues. Organizations being siloed within the company and just sort of never talking to each other. Mm-hmm. But startups, even like at Lyft, there was ample internal communication. Everybody was talking to everybody else about what they were doing. It was just that the priorities would change on a dime, and so that's the thing I've noticed with startups, is just the lack of top-down planning. A lot of things are happening organically, and you just have to roll with it. Fantastic. So I'll share the results now, unless anybody else wants to come in on that. Zach, I can see that you're.
I'll make one comment on that, and just riffing on Brian's point that being so flat across an org, whether no matter the size of your company, you're going and asking people for their time. We want to be as close to the initial production as possible, and that's usually when people are the busiest and they really don't want as much influence, or they might not want to hear it. But what's cool is because we are flat, we can also bring things to the table that might be valuable to them. To whether it's information about what another organization is doing that they could leverage, or just something along those lines. So I think looking at through the lens that it also presents opportunities, not just to solve our problems, but to solve that other team's problems, tends to move the needle. That was my one thought on the subject.
Fantastic. Okay, cool. So the results. So I wonder whether any of you guys have any comments on the results. What we can basically see is that the most important incentives are commercial for more businesses than they are operational. So that implies to me that the localization teams are really explicitly being targeted on things like NPS, new business growth. Is that sort of in line with, Alex, you kind of differentiated between those two different kinds of teams. Is that in line with what you expected? Any of the other panelists, is it in line with what you would expect for this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it makes sense. I mean, the one thing I would emphasize, and particularly for anybody that's in a localization role, it's often unfair to be graded on economic metrics, because localization is just one factor in your success in a market. Like I would highlight Japan as an example. So we've been doing very well in Japan in particular, but we have we have an in-country sales team and marketing team that are really driving that growth. So the localization in Japanese is, I mean, it's a prerequisite for us getting business in that market, because very few people speak English in Japan. But even if we had done a perfect localization, but we had done no marketing work, it wouldn't have delivered much in terms of results. So I generally prefer to be graded on operational metrics, and then the marketing team, that's the team that gets graded on revenue metrics. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I actually agree with Brian. I would put like commercial metrics third on my list. So the first would be like the linguistic quality metrics. So the terminology, the mistranslations, omissions, additions, whatever they may be. And then maybe user experience, which might differ depending on the markets. We have seen that in quite a few cases for our customers. And then lastly, on the third place for me, I would say it would be the business metrics. Yeah.
Very good. Cool. Well, unless anybody else wants to come in on that one, one thing I'd like to do just to sort of kick off the conversation in earnest. So obviously the title of this webinar is Building a Localization Team, Things You Can Get Right and Wrong. And so I wonder whether each of our panelists could come in with something that they think is particularly important to get right, or that can cause you particular issues when you get it wrong, and maybe a little bit of advice on how to get it right. Would anybody like to go first? Can I?
Yeah, I can.
Alex?
I would say, I think Iggy mentioned this as well, like team culture and effective communication within the team, and not just within the team, but with other stakeholders as well. But I do believe this having an appropriate mindset and culture would enable everyone in the team to align to the same goals and objectives, and that would really drive the needle in the end. And plus, it's always a nice bonus to work in a fun environment with sociable people. So
fantastic. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say one of the most important questions to resolve is where the localization team is going to live within the company. Because it's really kind of an oddball function, and it could end up in product, it could end up in engineering, it could end up in marketing. And my experience has been, it's really important to be in a part of the company that's focused on growth. So like at Notion, we're part of the marketing team, even though we're fairly technical and we work closely with engineering. We ultimately roll up to marketing, and they look at the spend on localization as the same as like running billboard advertising and things like that. It's a growth lever, and because of that, it's adequately resourced, and people aren't constantly asking us questions about, hey, can we reduce the per word prices here and there, and that kind of thing. I mean, they're much more interested of like, okay, if we spend $1 million on localization, how much money are we going to get back? And the answer is several times as much as you spend. that's where you want to be. Where you don't want to be is in an organization that's going to view localization as a cost center, because then you're just going to constantly be struggling to get resources.
And if you are in a localization business that looks at as localization as a cost center, is there advice that you would give? Is it just you should just leave? Is that the answer, or is it that is there a way that you can kind of navigate to a business structure that really values what you do you think?
Well, I would say you want to push to be, reorg, to have a reorg, so you're, in the right place in the company. So for example, you don't generally want to report to engineering, although you do need engineering support. There's a lot of technical work that needs to be done, but if you live in engineering, you're going to run into a bunch of issues, like with it being viewed as a cost center. The other thing you'll run into is people saying, hey, can't you just machine translate everything? AI is great. It's awesome. And you constantly have to push back on that kind of thing. So no, I don't think you just pack up and leave, but you definitely want to try to get moved to a different part of the organization before you get to that point.
Very good. So obviously we're going through the most important thing to get right and not to get wrong in localization. So I don't think we've had Zach or Iggy yet. Do either of you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think mine's kind of similar to Brian's, in that there's a tendency to look at localization as just a service, as in we need X, you deliver X. And moving away from that, it requires telling a story, at least in my experience. And it goes back to, okay, by delivering X, what's it actually doing for the company, and being able to tell that story. Whether it's always, maybe some of you could relate, it's always hard to draw a strict line to ROI within localization and not potentially be stepping on other toes, but that doesn't mean you can't tell a story of the overall value add. And I think that's the main thing, is it's not cornering yourself as a service, but more of a value add for the company itself.
That is a super interesting one. And we've actually got, I will get to you, Iggy and Sofia, but we do actually have a follow-up question that kind of relates to that, which is one of the entry form questions. How do you get common consensus on what you should be doing as a localization team when there are people disagreeing? And what metrics do you use? This is the one that I think relates to it, to convince stakeholders of the value of localization. So Zach, when you were talking about a clear localization story there, is that about metrics? Is that about, Brian talked about, being in a growth part of the business. How do you actually walk up to your manager and say, here are the metrics and the way that we're really delivering value?
100%. It depends what company you're working for. I work for a fintech company, not going into details, but the value add might be starkly different than the value add of what Lyft or like an Uber or a Google is looking for. So it's about aligning your story with what the company is looking for, whether it's growth, or it's quality. You need to see what stage your company is in, know the target audience, and then align your story to that. If you're in a growth stage and they're just wanting to expand country after country, well, show how localization can, be the lever that makes that happen quicker. If they're looking for more ROI next year with less money, start talking about machine translation and start talking about the different levers that we have that can not just impact, just our one division, but the company as a whole. And I think that's the best angle to take, is just look at your own situation and measure it from there.
So most important thing you can get right or wrong. I think we've still got answers to come from Iggy and Sofia. Do either of you want to jump in on that one next?
I can jump in on that one. I dare say also you're not going to be surprised by what I think is important to get right. It's about having a right tool in place, having a good TMS in place. It will enable you to work efficiently. It will enable you to, actually going back to what Zach said, show also return on investment, right? So investing in a TMS, it does make sense in the long run, because with that you have also translation memories, right? You have term bases for terminology, which will enable you to leverage content again and again, right? So the kind of spend reduces that you have, or the outlay, because you can leverage content that you have already localized in the past. Fair enough, you might still tweak it, but you build, right, those memories of content that you can use again and again, right, specific to your business, to your company. And a second point on that is that such a TMS, right, others are available. Such TMSs, they will also deliver data, right? Have that metric in place, be that throughput, right? To highlight, within the business, what are you actually processing? What are you delivering on? It could be other metrics like the time spent, right? The turnaround times, things like that. So having the right tool in place will enable you to deliver on all of those things. And
finally, over to Iggy, the final person to answer. Most important thing to get right in a localization team. Do you have an answer for us?
Yeah, sorry, I was frantically taking notes, trying to not say the same thing as has already been said, but I will play a little bit on it because I think it's very interesting. Particularly this topic of like, where is the localization team placed within the company? I don't think I've ever seen kind of like a similar, in any of the companies I've worked in, it's never been a similar setup. There's always been different placements, and that has loads of different implications as well. But it's one of those annoying things where actually, as a localization professional, you're very likely not going to have the chance to influence that decision, right? Because if someone decides that we need to set up a localization team from the get-go, that decision is ultimately made by someone else. So even if you are the first hire, you can definitely challenge it. But once that team has been set up, it's so difficult to change it in my experience. So if then, like, instead of focusing on what you can impact, I think it's important to, obviously from the placement, you can draw a few assumptions about what the company is expecting from you and expecting you to deliver. Whether or not that aligns with your values, kind of relate to what I talked about earlier, that depends. But I would use that as kind of like the basis for understanding what is expected of the team, and then make sure that you get the team members that can deliver on that promise, or on the requirement rather. And I fully support what Sofia was saying as well about having the tooling to also match with whatever your company's goals are, because there are so many tools out there these days, and while there are loads of similarities, there are also quite a few differences, and different tools specialize in different things. And I think it's important to be conscious about making those decisions, and it's maybe somewhere where a localization professional would be asked for their opinion rather than it being from someone higher up making that decision. So I think that's a very key point where you can actually influence the decisions.
Thanks very much, Iggy. So we've got 10 minutes to go. I've just got to quickly go through some housekeeping notes. The first note to say is that there is another episode of The Alignment hot on the heels of this one. It is in 2 weeks' time. It is on the July 26th. That is Wednesday, same time as this, in 2 weeks. If you're enjoying this one, it would be great to see you there. We have got speakers from HubSpot, RS, XTN, and we've also got another speaker. The reason that it is held up as it is with their PR team awaiting approval as we speak. Obviously, you can infer it is a slightly bigger business, so we're really excited about them. And that is going to be about speed and scale without compromising quality. So really excited about that. You can, there's a link being posted in the chat right now, and you can scan this link if you would like to join us. In addition to that, if you'd like to learn more about Phrase, please do scan this QR code. I'm personally, I'm not very good at QR codes. I get the phone out and fumble. So I think the link is being posted in the chat as well. They've got all kinds of exciting offers and deals, and I think you've had a chance to hear a little bit more about Phrase. And then the final plug before we return to the questions is that we are offering a free test. So obviously, global app testing allows you to send your product around the world to understand different user experiences. If you would like to take advantage of that service, you can sign up right here, right now. and then we will give you a free test if you qualify. So we'll contact you within 24 hours and get you started so you can understand a little bit about what that means and how we can help you understand the different experiences that your users are having around the world. So do take advantage of that. It is not something that we are able to offer every time. Yeah, hop right on and have a go. So I will now return to the questions. So we talked a little bit about in-house versus external localization resource. I wonder if our panelists have an idea of something that they would always outsource, or something that they would always keep in-house no matter what within the localization function. If there's any strong opinions you guys have about this should be in-house or vice versa. So yeah, I don't know if there's anybody who wants to jump in on that. First of all, Brian's put up his hand.
Yeah. So a good example for us would be help center content versus marketing copy. Marketing copy, I think we're always going to want to have our hands on that, just because our people understand the product really well. Help center content, that's the kind of thing we're pretty comfortable sending to an agency, or if it's a second tier language, even machine translating it, because honestly, who reads the manual? But definitely, the high visibility content, whether it's marketing copy or high visibility content within our apps, that's generally the kind of stuff we want to handle in-house as much as possible.
Fantastic. I'm just aware we're slowly running down on time, so I do want to get to some of the questions in the chat. So we've got a question from Jenna here. Jenna says she is a localization project manager who manages some projects of large scale in more than 45 languages and 80 locales. They rely on more than 80% on vendors for their workload. Question to the panel. When you manage a project of many languages and locale, what is your main management style? Are you in waterfall, agile, lean six sigma? I'm actually not familiar with that one, or something else. So yeah, I don't know whether you guys will go in for formal management styles. Zach's put up his hand.
Yep, I think this one, this is an old one. It's a fun one. It really depends on your situation and the content you're working on. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but that being said, it's always looking through that like lean six lens, at least from the companies I work for. Even if your number one goal is just high quality, you still need to do it in an efficient and effective manner. So whether you have like the timing to actually plan something out in more of a waterfall fashion, you're still going to want to look through that lens of maximum efficiency, which I know that's not like sticking truly to the lean six way, but that's the way I kind of look at it, that there's like one perfect answer for it, but as long as you kind of look through that lens, you're probably on the right track.
Very good. Does anybody else want to comment on that one before I move to the next question? Anyone have a preferred management style for managing lots of different external vendors? Very good. Okay. So an anonymous attendee has asked, on Brian's example in Japan, so maybe one for you, Brian, how do you separate out the other factors that contribute to growth from the impact of localization? So obviously earlier we were saying that it is unfair to measure localization's effectiveness just in terms of growth, because there's so many other things that come into it. Is there a way that you can separate that out and make more intelligent decisions? Over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I'd say it's actually, I mean, it's a real challenge. I think, in markets like Japan, it's pretty easy to see. It's easier to see. But in a lot of markets like in Europe, where, the rate of English proficiency is quite high and multilingualism in general is quite high, it's a lot harder to tease that signal out compared to everything else, because you typically have confounding factors like, there's a big marketing push along with the localization. So is it being driven by the marketing push, or is it being driven by localization, or is it a combination of the two? So one of the things I like to do when I'm making the case for resourcing is to look at what other peer companies have done or are doing, and point out that, like, well, there's a reason why our competitors are in 15 languages, and we shouldn't assume they just did that on a whim. And you can also look at the growth story of older companies that went from being in one language to being in multiple languages. Like Facebook is kind of a classic example of that. You know, and there's a degree of common sense to it. You know, if you want to be successful in certain markets in particular, I mean, being in those languages that are relevant is it's a prerequisite to doing anything else. You know, there's no point in hiring salespeople in Japan if your product isn't in Japanese. But actually, you know, putting together a dashboard that shows that we're getting X dollars back from our spend on localization is really very difficult.
Very good. The next question in the Q&A is, so I think Brian's marked that, but also for Sofia, in building an internal TMS system rather than buying something off the shelf. So I would imagine that is from somebody from a larger organization if they're going to start building internal tools. Is that something that you see at Phrase? Is, you know, maybe working with people on bespoke modules? What do you think of that?
We do see it, absolutely. I mean, we also see the case where clients have had an in-house translation management system in the past, but then come to us because they say, we don't have the resources to maintain it anymore, right? For whatever reason that may be, right? Be it manpower, people power, be it the spend, be it the effort of actually keeping it at a level where other, you know, TMSs that exist on the market are already one step ahead. So I think having or purchasing a TMS, investing in a TMS would be, I mean, I say it because of obviously working where I work, but you're always going to have an advantage that way, right? You don't need to take care of that development yourself. And you will have also compatibility, right? Vendor agnostic systems where you can, when you need to scale, bring in other vendors on that platform much more easily, I would say. So yes, absolutely, we do see it. But I would probably err towards saying actually that a more scalable solution in the long run would be to invest in a TMS.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sofia. Just before I move on, I'm conscious that we only have a couple of minutes left. Does anybody else in the panel have any experience that would relate to that? Because I know that that's quite a niche thing that not anybody could jump in on. Okay.
I'll just don't do that. Don't do that. Engineering time is very scarce and their time is better spent. Like if there's something the TMS doesn't do, then you build tooling around the TMS. That's usually pretty straightforward, but don't try to build a TMS.
That's I like that. That's a straight question with a straight answer. Too many people talk around the subject. Okay, so final question from the Q&A. So if you do have to drop off, I'm aware it's 6 o'clock. By all means, leave us. It was great to have everybody here. I'm going to stay on for just a few more minutes, maybe 3 more minutes, just to get through the final couple of questions, and then we will say goodbye formally. But if you do have to leave us, thanks so much for joining. It was great to see you, and again, we hope to see you on the next webinar, which I can click through to the slide for. So yes, do sign up and make sure you come to the next one. So final questions. Thank you everybody for just staying on 1 more minute. Konstantin asks, do you see localization teams expanding their area of responsibility and taking custody over large language models in the organization? It took us the whole webinar, but we got to the AI question in the end. It's an inevitability of these things. Zach, I think you've marked that as something you want to answer. Shall I pass over to you?
Sure. Yeah, this is a fun one. So I view my roles shifted a little bit, and I see this in other organizations to where you're just not the person that's producing, but you're also stepping into more of a consulting role, especially with larger organizations that are spinning up resources dedicated to this work, not just in the localization space. So it needs, going back to that Lane 6 statement, looking through the lens of just being efficient. Right now, it makes sense to stay educated and step into a consulting role. I'll keep it brief for time.
Fantastic. Thank you then. I think that was our final question. Thank you everybody for joining us. Don't forget to attend the next one, which is happening this time on the 26th of July in 2 weeks' time. It was great to have you. And if you would like to take advantage of that free test, then do just click the link. We'll send you a follow-up email after, so you can check your inboxes as well. And I will bid everybody adieu. It's 6 o'clock here in the UK, so we're off home. And yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks, we hope. Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
I've actually got to click end now. Bye, guys.